Hello again. Before we start talking about the organization ALEC, we need to first discuss the act of lobbying. And this is something that is pretty confusing for people. It tends to be said in hushed tones as if it's illegal or somehow illicit. But essentially, lobbying is when a special interest group, such as tobacco or oil companies, hire a lobbyist to work as an intermediary between themselves and lawmakers. So these lobbyists tend to be people with a lot of good connections. They're very friendly, and they're sort of the wheeler dealers of the world. And what they do is they take different ideas that the special interest group wants to see, and they present it to the politicians. Everything about this is 100% legal. All of their rights are protected by the First Amendment. And according to some estimates, there are approximately 15,000 lobbyists working in DC alone. So it's not something that's really hidden in the shadows. It sometimes seems as though it's illegal or not very above the bar, but it is a legitimate business tactic. So there are different types of lobbying. There's single issue lobbying, where a company might have one specific thing that they want to push. That the lobbyist then approaches different lawmakers that are in power, to be able to make that law come into existence. And then there are multiple issue types of lobbying, and this would be more, labor unions that might have several things that they push for. For example, health care, sick days, working conditions. So these are multiple things that then that lobbyist will come to the lawmakers and try and push their agenda. So you can see these politicians are obviously more than happy to help. So there are single and multiple issue types of lobbying, but there are also different ways to go about getting what you want. Direct lobbying is just what we've been talking about, when a lobbyist directly approaches a politician or their office with a set of requests, essentially. But then there's outside lobbying, which is a bit trickier for corporations to do, because this is taking a concept and trying to manipulate or change public opinion in order to then coerce the politicians in order to change their the laws or present legislation that might benefit the corporation. This can happen with people knowing that it is happening. Other times it can be sort of a covert methodology, but it all basically amounts to the same thing, that these corporations are using different tactics in order to influence politicians and lawmakers. It can be a good thing. Non-profit organizations are sometimes disenfranchised. They don't have a lot of power or say in government, so lobbyists will give them that voice and contact to a politician. But more times than not, for-profit organizations have more clout, have more money, and are able to push through agendas that aren't always for the public's good, but more for their bottom line. It sounds crappy, but it really is just the way that it is. So now that you understand a little bit more about lobbying, we can talk about ALEC. ALEC is the American Legislative Exchange Council and was formed in 1975. This organization is completely tax exempt and non-profit. Their operating costs are covered by the yearly dues that corporations and politicians pay in order to participate. Now, some of these corporations pay upwards to $25,000 in order to belong to ALEC. But let's just look at how ALEC describes itself. This is from their website. It is a nonpartisan membership association for conservative state lawmakers who share a common belief in limited government, free markets, federalism, and individual liberty. For more than 35 years, ALEC has been the ideal means of creating and delivering public policy ideas aimed at protecting and expanding our free society. Literally hundreds of dedicated ALEC members have worked together to create, develop, introduce, and guide to enact many of the cutting-edge conservative policies that have now become the law in the states. The strategic knowledge and training ALEC members have received over the years has been integral to these victories. Okay. So, let's just wipe away that nonpartisan idea. It isn't. Political membership to ALEC is a fluid thing, so doing the best that I could with the information that I had, out of the 523 politicians that I saw that are connected to ALEC, 483 are Republican, 39 are Democratic, and there is only one independent. So I suppose technically they are bipartisan, and of course technically right is the best kind of right. But my political beliefs aside, their tenets read like a Republican playbook. Small government, free market, individual freedom, states' rights, these are the ideas that the foundation of the Republican Party is built upon. And here's the key point. ALEC is not a lobbying organization. It doesn't have to be a lobbying organization because it is so powerful. They have created what they call task forces. And I dare you to find an aspect of your life that isn't covered by at least one of these following 9 topics. They have civil justice, commerce, insurance, economic development, communications and technology, education, energy, environment, agriculture, health and human service, international relations, justice performance project, and the tax and fiscal policy. Now, each task force is headed by a legislative member and a person from the private sector. They refer to these task forces as public policy laboratories, which is comical. In fact, if you were to take the descriptions at face value, you wouldn't be faulted for thinking that there's some sort of political matchmaking service that just facilitates the meeting of like-minded people. So before we start talking about what happens at an ALEC meeting, we need to talk about who's attending these meetings. And I'm pretty sure you're going to recognize a few of these names. These are companies that either currently have ties to or have had ties in the past belonging to this organization. AT&T, Bayer, Coca-Cola, Pepsi, ExxonMobil, DirecTV, Dow Chemical, FedEx, Ford, Geico, GlaxoSmithKline, Johnson & Johnson, Kraft Foods, Amazon.com, Hewlett-Packard, Humana, IBM, John Deere, Koch Industries, Microsoft, Nestle USA, Outback Steakhouse, Pfizer, Blue Cross Blue Shield Association, Boeing, Chevron, Walmart, Philip Morris, Sallie Mae, Sony, Sprint Nextel, United Airlines, Verizon, Visa, Walgreens. There are hundreds of corporations that have connections to ALEC or currently participate on their task forces. Just because one wasn't listed doesn't necessarily mean that they don't belong to this organization. I could go on and on and on, and I only stopped because I have a tiny little whiteboard and there are only so many hours in the day. These are household names. These are companies whose services and products we all use every single day. They are the ones that are deciding the legislation in this country. And do you think Dow Chemical really cares about renewable energy? Do you think that Blue Cross Blue Shield wants to see a low healthcare cost for the American people? This is something that most people don't know is happening. And part of the reason why I'm doing this video is because since going into education, research, and writing about it, I understand how deep these connections go into every aspect of our lives. It is an incredible thing once you start to learn about it and you start to feel like a conspiracy theorist because of how widespread this connection is. But it is 100% true. Now, you have an idea of who's involved, so let's talk about what happens at one of these ALEC events. On the surface, it seems like any other convention until you realize what it is they're actually doing. They refer to this process as a think tank. But between the dinners and entertainment, not a lot can be accomplished in the 2 to 3 days that they attend. So these corporations arrive at the conventions with what they call model legislation. Model legislation is a nice way of saying, hey, we already did the work for you, so here you go. Take this back to your state and do what you will with it. I'm signifying this legislation with the different multicolored dots there because obviously corporations have certain things that they want to see happen in government that will make their lives easier and their profits increase. So here are little legislators. They're representing their own states. And they attend these task force meetings where they are presented with legislation from AT&T and Chevron. And they then take this legislation back to their home states and present it to their governments. They have an incredible success rate. 20% of the legislation that they propose and bring back to their states gets turned into law. That's 1/5 of the model legislation that they write becomes law in this country. Now, they are behind the strict voter ID laws that are starting to go into effect, namely in North Carolina. They have a lot of anti-EPA laws. Thank you, Chevron. And one of the most famous cases that you might have heard of was written by the National Rifle Association called the Stand Your Ground Law. This was made famous by the shooting of Trayvon Martin. This law was used as George Zimmerman's defense. And strangely enough, after Trayvon's shooting in February, there was a mass exodus of corporations leaving ALEC and trying to deny any connection to it. We have General Electric leaving in July of 2012. Pepsi, Coca-Cola, Kraft, Amazon, Blue Cross, Blue Shield, and loads of representatives as well left shortly after that shooting.
Okay, so that is a very, very, very brief overview of what ALEC is and their process and reason for existing. The reason I'm interested in it is because as I was researching the different things that affect education and teachers and curriculums and textbooks and everything that goes into making our education system what it is, I kept coming back to this organization, and there's so many companies. You cannot overstate how many companies belong or have belonged at some point to this organization. It is massive beyond any comprehension, and it just has so much control and influence over every part of our lives that it's hard to overstate the importance of knowing about it and being aware of what it does. So as I was going into education, looking into it, I realized how many of these corporations, education-related corporations and foundations, were connected. So we're talking the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. If you talk to any teacher, even though that foundation does amazing things in third world countries and in Africa for malaria and birth control for impoverished families, things like that, for teachers, Bill Gates is not a very friendly name in the classroom. They've had connections. I think they've since said that they've cut ties to ALEC, but again, it's a fluid thing. They come and go. Connections Academy, which is one of the largest charter school corporations in the country, Intuit, Kaplan, which you should know, the National Association of Charter School Authorizers. These are the people that will set up shop in your state and authorize the creation or transition of charter schools. These are the people that are on these task forces that are writing the laws that are then coming back to your state. The National Board for Professional Teaching Standards, Scantron, which I think we're all familiar with, K-12, which is another charter school company, and yeah, several others. Obviously, because there is an education task force, there are education companies that try to belong and flex their influence, basically. ALEC is also behind the parent trigger laws, which I haven't really spoken about. This is when a majority of the citizens in a community and a public school, a normal traditional public school, can trigger the transition from a public school to a charter school. So obviously charter school companies want parents to be able to have this power, making them believe that choice is always going to be better, which it a lot of the times isn't. It might sound like a conspiracy. It might sound very crazy to think that, there's this Illuminati type organization that controls everything behind the scenes. But the fact is, you won't hear about them because they belong to ALEC. I know it sounds crazy, but News Corporation, which is owned by Rupert Murdoch, he owns, obviously, Fox News, the New York Post, Wall Street Journal, Time Warner Cable is associated with ALEC. They own CNN, Time Magazine, HBO, Comcast, which is in charge of NBC Universal, so MSNBC, all of the other news organizations associated with that, and Xfinity. Every single major news affiliate is associated with ALEC. So of course they're not going to talk about this and bring it to the forefront. You'll also find out, the more that you research this, whenever they do have meetings, there are a lot of advocacy groups that will track their movements, obviously. Because they are a non-profit organization, they actually do have to be a bit more transparent than I think they would like. So you can track how much money corporations pay to be a member. This is how we know that, like Coca-Cola, for instance, spends tens of thousands of dollars, did, to be on task forces, things like that. But they also announce when they have their meetings, and there are always massive protests outside of these, conventions where they hold them. The next one actually is in December 3rd through the 5th. So if you'd like to register, it closes November 6th. And I guarantee there will be protests outside, and you won't hear about it on any news coverage. So what's interesting to me is, as I was doing my research for this video and, in the past, I came across a New York Times article in which they interviewed a lawyer for ALEC. And this is just straight from the article. Alan P. Dye, a lawyer for ALEC, acknowledged that the group's practice of communicating with lawmakers about specific bills could meet the federal definition of lobbying, if not for an exception that he said applied when such interactions were a result of nonpartisan research and analysis. ALEC simply offers independently produced material for elected officials to consider, Mr. Dye said. Quote, "If you look at the ALEC method of operating, it is all based on nonpartisan research and analysis. They have a consensus building, pros and cons, everyone has a say." Now, the other side to this organization that is a bit more Big Brother, bit more sinister in my mind. It's not just that they create legislation and hand it to your state officials. And I guarantee, if you go on to, there is a great advocacy website called sourcewatch.org. If you go on to sourcewatch.org, they have lists of all of the different congressional members, representatives by state, so you can go ahead and look up your state or surrounding states, whoever you want, and see who's connected. Not only does ALEC write the legislation, the members of ALEC write legislation and hand it to these lawmakers, they also keep track of all the proposed legislation in each state. So things that are just part of the normal business of government, they keep track and send out little APBs to their members saying, yes, we agree with this, or no, we don't agree with this, and certain talking points for them to come out for or against that aligns with the ALEC philosophy. It's just, to me, that's disturbing on so many levels, but it's removing the thought process that a lawmaker has, however much that is. Even though they don't talk about it, politicians must be getting something out of it. It's been proven in a couple of instances that some politicians have received gifts that are above and beyond what they are allowed to receive. They've been flown out, all paid vacations for their families and gifts and dinners and things like that. But I think it goes deeper than that. I think, not to be cynical, but many politicians will say whatever they need to say and believe and toe the line of whatever they need to in order to be reelected or move up that ladder, that government ladder, there has to be a quid pro quo going on. So, Chevron says, take this legislation back to your state. If you pass it and if you do everything right, come re-election, you'll get a nice little investment into your campaign fund. These politicians, these corporations, they don't do it out of the kindness of their heart. They're not looking out for you. They are looking out for themselves. They are looking out for their bottom line, for their stake in the world. They say that they go along with conservative legislation. And again, my politics aside, conservative legislation tends to be pro-corporation and anti-person. It's just the way that it is. I think that's a pretty universally accepted thing. So, there you go. I encourage you to do more research into ALEC. It is sort of like tripping down the rabbit hole. Once you start discovering the connections, you realize if you were to morally choose to not support companies that are associated with this organization, you wouldn't really be left with anything. It branches across so many aspects of your life, from your internet to your cable to your healthcare to where you eat. Cracker Barrel belongs to ALEC. You can't go get your country fried chicken. It's interesting, at the very least. It's interesting. So, again, I encourage you to go look into more information. There's plenty of stuff online. But of course, always fact check and check the sources. Don't believe every single thing that you read, including what I say. So, that is ALEC in a nutshell. If you have anything that you'd like to add or any comments or questions, please feel free to comment on this video or visit my website, which is honestpracticum.com. I'm also on Twitter and Facebook. And thank you very much. I will see you next time.